Hi everyone, this PowerPoint is a quick overview of the women's movement in the 1970s. We'll be making some references to events that happened in the 60s too, which is when the second women's movement, post-war World War II movement, really gets underway. So let's jump in. Person who probably most responsible for kicking off the second women's movement, Betty Friedan, journalist and writer who married young in the 1950s, started a family, and she was writing pieces primarily for women's magazines, dealing with editors who were entirely men. And if she was writing kind of lighthearted, fluffy pieces, they were accepted. When she wanted to write about more serious topics, subjects impacting American women in the 1950s, her stories were rejected. She got frustrated with this and also attended a 10-year reunion from her college, Smith College, where she graduated. Betty Friedan had graduated there in the 1940s. Went back 10 years later, and she was distraught and talking to female students who weren't very excited about college coursework and instead were focused on getting married, starting a family. So she started wondering, where are young women absorbing this kind of dominant message from popular culture? How are they absorbing this? She began looking at the content, mainstream media, magazines, newspapers, and that became the basis of her landmark best-selling book, Feminine Mystique, that came out in the early 60s and really got a tremendous amount of attention. Betty Friedan received letters from tens of thousands of American women telling her that this book had changed their lives, and it really kickstarted the second women's movement of the 1960s, which is going to carry over into the 70s. So we mentioned how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that banned public segregation also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and women members of Congress and the Senate worked hard to get additional language inserted in this act that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race and sex, is the term that was used then. Probably use the term gender now. But the EEOC was going to become important for women in the decades after its creation. And the first organization in the 60s that forms in support of women's rights, women's movement, is NOW, the National Organization for Women, 1966. Betty Friedan instrumental in helping form this. NOW was a group that believed in lobbying, applying pressure to legislators at the state and national level, and kind of working for advancement of women and political change that way, as opposed to grassroots organizing. And by the late 60s, you have the first real feminist works appear. Robin Morgan's collection of essays, Sisterhood is Powerful, that she edited with essays by a variety of feminist writers, comes out in 1969, and that title even became a catchphrase. Black women were active too, forming in the early 70s the National Black Feminist Organization, and there was quite a bit of unity between black and white feminists, but there were some issues that they regarded differently. The issue of work was regarded differently by black women than white women. And the National Black Feminist Organization, an important women's group that formed, as I said, in the early 70s as well. Few examples of prominent black feminists from the 70s. Alice Walker, author, probably best known for her novel The Color Purple. You see her here on the cover of Ms. Magazine, the magazine established by Gloria Steinem in the 1970s. controversial Angela Davis, a professor at UCLA who was supportive of the Black Panthers, involved with them, also for a time a member of the American Communist Party. Really interesting, compelling person. This book that I have here, Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, fantastic book, a study of three prominent Black women singers of the 20s and 30s, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday. Also at this time, and this was well depicted if you watched the Hulu miniseries that aired earlier in 2020, Mrs. America, Shirley Chisholm, a Democratic congresswoman, became the first African-American woman elected to Congress in 1968, and then the first Black candidate for either party's presidential nomination when she participated in Democratic Party primaries in 1972. And the higher prominence of feminism was reflected in the fact that feminist writers became nationally known figures. Two of the more prominent, Kate Millett, who wrote very impactful book, Sexual Politics, that came out in the early 70s, and Gloria Steinem, journalist and editor who established Ms. Magazine. I mentioned in class that in the mainstream media there was this tendency to pit women against one another and still evaluate them according to, perceptions of their physical appearance. Gloria Steinem, who was regarded as attractive, male writers couldn't figure out why she was a feminist, because you had this persistent mythology that someone who was a feminist was somehow unhappy. And you saw this tendency reflected in these respective covers of Time and Newsweek, with the unflattering sketch of Kate Millett. She's identified just as Kate Millett of Women's Lib, while Newsweek presented this flattering picture of Gloria Steinem as the new woman. Title IX, which came through Congress, passed during the Nixon administration, and the work of two people, Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, Congresswoman Patsy Mink of Hawaii, and this was the act that became the basis of women's athletics in college, as it prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in any education program supported by federal funds. And so it's really, as I note here, the beginning, the springboard for the expansion of women's sports, women's athletics at all educational levels. I mentioned college, but really at all educational levels, in secondary and in college as well. And as Eric Foner mentioned, there was a huge battle in the 70s over the very simple Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, that had first been proposed in the 1920s, reintroduced in 1971. It passed Congress and the Senate, but over the next several years, it failed to win approval of the required 38 states in order to become an amendment. And interestingly, one of the leading opponents of ERA was St. Louis area activist Phyllis Schlafly, who argued that passage of ERA would threaten what she termed the special status of women. Schlafly made a lot of false, outlandish claims, such as the fact if ERA passed, women would be subject to the draft, the world would become one big unisex bathroom. A number of the things she fearmongered about have come to pass, not the drafting of women, but the fact that women are now able to serve in the military. We do have unisex bathrooms, and society has survived. But She's an interesting figure, a very toxic figure from this era, too, who played a major role in preventing the Equal Rights Amendment from being passed by the required 38 states. So I mentioned how the women's movement in the 60s, and this continued into the 70s, had these two parallel paths. Professional women like Betty Friedan, who formed organizations like NOW that really focused on women's issues at the legislative level. And then you had women who came out of the civil rights movement and the student movements of the 1960s. And these were the women who worked at the community level, the grassroots level, frequently employing what was called consciousness raising strategy, meaning they organized consciousness raising groups, which were informal groups where women could meet and comfortably talk about issues affecting them. Both these approaches played a role in the direction of the women's movement of the 1970s. And Eric Foner talks about the raised awareness that the women's movement generated, its accomplishments. Interestingly, the opposition that I mentioned by Phyllis Schlafly was primarily grassroots work as well. The women's movement had an impact in myriad ways in politics, in athletics, as I mentioned, everyday life, popular culture. It's one of the significant social political developments of the 1970s.